Okay, I'd like to say good evening, everyone. I'm Jean James, President of the Canberra Jung Society. Thank you for joining us again. This time it's only online. So sadly, there are no preliminary Robert Tulip music, literacy, library access or supper. Let's us first acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. This evening, we're delighted to welcome again our very own Dr. Richard Barz, our scholar, philosopher, and a great supporter of the Jung Society. While doing research in India in 1983, Richard and his colleagues encountered a wonderful storyteller who held a large group of villagers enthralled with his fascinating tale of three tricksters. They recorded the story and published it as The Prince and the Vizier's Son. Richard will use his tale to bring the shadow out of the dark corners where it hides in our unconscious, personal and collective, the shadow that Jung describes in his 1954 article on the psychology of the Trickster-Figure. Dr. Richard Barz taught courses in Indian culture, including Hindi, Urdu, and Indian religion and politics at the Australian National University for several decades. Richard will talk for about an hour. Then we'll move on to discussion and questions. Note that we'll be sharing this session with people online and recording it for later reference. Please remain muted while Richard is speaking. Use the Zoom chat button for comments and questions. So I'll hand over now to Richard to continue on.
Thank you very much, Jean. Thank you. Now let's see, I'll get myself organized here and centered. All right. Well, is everyone muted? And I hope everyone can hear me all right. Good. Okay. Well, this evening, as Jean said, I'm going to talk about a North Indian folktale. The folktale didn't have a name because it was told to me and my colleague Yogendra Yadav in a village in central Uttar Pradesh in India. And the storyteller just started out telling the story. So when we published it, we gave it the name The Prince and the Vizier's Son. That's after the two main characters. Well, this story, The Prince and the Vizier's Son, is not a didactic story. It's not a preachy folktale. It's a folktale for fun, and it's lighthearted. But it's very interesting. It has in it, it has a very great resonation with one of Carl Jung's key elements of his thought, the idea of individuation, the way that a person is able to proceed to a full, whole individuality. And I'll show you how this story is connected with that idea. But first, I better talk a little bit about individuation. Carl Jung himself, in his own words, gave the most wonderfully concise explanation of what he meant by individuation in his 1939 article, The Conscious, the Unconscious, and Individuation. And I'll just read you what he said, the way that he explained that idea, very a key idea for his thought. Conscious and unconscious do not make a whole when one of them is suppressed and injured by the other. If they must contend, let it be at least a fair fight with equal rights on both sides. Both are aspects of life. Consciousness should defend its reason and protect itself, and the chaotic life of the unconscious should be given the chance of having its way too, as much of it as we can stand. This means open conflict and open collaboration at once. That evidently is the way human life should be. It's the old game of hammer and anvil. Between them, the patient iron is forged into an indestructible whole, an individual. This, roughly, is what I mean by the individuation process. Well, what could be plainer? In order to become complete individuals, we must allow our conscious and our unconscious to contend and collaborate together. But there's a problem. Since we're unconscious of our unconscious, how on earth can we reach it so that we may let it interact with our conscious? Well, Jung had an answer for that too. He was fascinated with myths, folk stories, and fairy tales. The source of his fascination was his realization that the motifs typical of such literature, and that includes human fantasy in general, were rooted in the unconscious of every person in the world. He considered those motifs, which he called archetypes, to constitute the instinctive behavior characteristics of the human species. It's through becoming conscious of those archetypes in the unconscious that progress can be made on the path to individuation. Now, an example of how this works can be found in one of the most widespread of the archetypes in myths, tales, and stories, the archetype of the trickster. In his 1954 article on the psychology of the trickster-figure, Jung lists 4 characteristics, and this is important because you've got to be able to recognize the trickster, 4 characteristics by which the trickster can be recognized and so brought from the unconscious into the conscious. The first way you can tell a trickster, that's the archetypal trickster, that the trickster has a fondness for sly jokes and malicious pranks. So sly jokes and malicious pranks. The second thing is the trickster has an ability to shift shapes. He's a shape shifter. And the third thing, the trickster is exposed to all kinds of tortures. And finally, the fourth one, the trickster is an approximation to the figure of a savior. So those are the 4 ways you can recognize the trickster in the unconscious. Now, when a person consciously recognizes a trickster in a story, a play, or a folk tale to be the archetypal trickster in his or her unconscious, then she or he has put the conscious in touch with the unconscious. Then that person can proceed towards individuation. But how can a trickster in a story be recognized as the trickster in the unconscious? Well, a good storyteller or author uses double meanings and insinuations, often risque or amusing, to entertain an audience. But such hints also alert the more perceptive listener or reader to the presence of a deeper level of meaning in the tale. These double entendre may be especially associated with the trickster in the story and can evoke the trickster of the unconscious out of the fictional trickster in the story. Well, to give an illustration, when I was 14 or 15, I saw that really wonderful 1941 film noir, The Maltese Falcon, with Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor and Peter Lorre and Sidney Greenstreet, all of them past masters at portraying the trickster. Well, when I first saw that film, I thought it was a great detective story. I really liked it, but I didn't see anything more in that than that. Now, later on, when I was more sophisticated, it happened that I saw the film again several decades later. And when I saw the Maltese Falcon for the second time, I was astounded at how many hidden allusions there are in the film to homosexuality. I had no idea of that when I saw it the first time. It completely went over my head, and I just missed it entirely. Now, these allusions were triggers that revealed to me when I saw it the second time the possibility of finding, along with hidden meaning in words and actions, another dimension concealed in and below the experiences of ordinary conscious life. Now, The Prince and the Vizier's Son, the story I'm going to tell tonight, it is, like the Maltese Falcon, a tale of tricksters. Each of the tricksters in the story I'll tell, in this folk tale, illustrates every one of those four characteristics. Each of those tricksters in the story loves sly jokes and malicious pranks. Each one is a shapeshifter, but in this story, there's no magic. This is not a magical story. It's a story set in ordinary time, indeed, in that fairy tale time, beyond time, but not magical. But the shape-shifting is done with disguises. So the characters in the story change their appearance through disguises. And they also are all exposed to all kinds of tortures. And finally, they're all approximations. They all do the act of saving. They're all saviors. Now, again, like the Maltese Falcon, The Prince and the Vizier's Son is full of double meanings associated with the actions and speech of the tricksters in the story. Double meanings that can trigger recognition of the trickster archetype that's concealed in the unconscious reality below mundane awareness. So the double meanings are very important, in other words, in the story. And as I tell the story, I'll point out those of the double meanings that are imperceptible outside of their Indian cultural setting. Well, in December 1983, and could we have the first picture, please? There's a map. Is Robbie there? Could we have the map? Map. The first picture? Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Good. Okay. Well, in 1983, my colleague Yogendra Yadav and I went to North India, to the area around Lucknow. Now, if you notice Nepal on the map and look at the green state below it, you find Lucknow. Yeah, I've underlined it. Good. So we went to Lucknow, and it was in a village about 20 or 30 kilometers east of Lucknow called Dulapur that we recorded this story. But Yogendra and I didn't go to India to record folktales. In fact, at that time, not only did I not know much about Carl Jung, I had minimal interest in folk literature. So we didn't go there for folktales. Instead, we had an Australian Research Grants Committee funding to do linguistic research on the Abiti language. Now, Abiti is a language spoken around Lucknow. It's mostly a village language today, but it has been in the past a literary language. It's very closely related to Standard Hindi. So we had this project to do a particular linguistic problem we were investigating. Now, we found the best way to do that, the best way to do our research on the language was to get a motorcycle. We had a motorcycle, and we traveled around central Uttar Pradesh. We had quite a large area we covered. And what we would do is we would go out and we would go to some small town or settlement, and we'd leave our motorcycle with a shopkeeper, and then we'd walk out on a road, usually a minor road. We'd walk out on a road until we found somebody who seemed to be, not having too much to do. We would ask that person if they could tell us stories or jokes or something. And then we'd say, do you mind if we record it? Because the idea was we had to gather a very large amount of unself-conscious speech in order to analyze it later, to do our linguistic research. Well, now, could we have the next picture, please? Next picture. Yeah. So to do that, as I say, we're walking down the road, and we came upon a man standing by the road, and he didn't look like he had any particular business to do. He looked very relaxed. So we said to him, we struck a conversation up, and eventually we asked him, would you like to tell us a story that we could record? And he said, look, I don't know any stories, but in my village, of Dulapur, which is just over there to the right, about 2 kilometers off the road, there is the most wonderful storyteller there. And he has so many stories. He'll be very happy to tell you a story. And so we said, oh, that's wonderful. Look, we would love to meet him. Could you introduce us? And he said, yeah, of course. And so we went to Dulapur. Now, this is what Dulapur looked like, but this is not Dulapur, because we were so busy, I'll explain later, trying to make our recording that we didn't have time for photographs. But this is a village in the same area, central Uttar Pradesh, and in the same time, mid-1980s. And you can see a village in India, North India. It has very narrow streets. It's a very compact. The buildings are made of earth or brick. And it's like a big family, and people living in it, even though they're different castes, they feel somehow they belong to a particular group opposed to the outside. They have a certain sense of kinship. Well, we went into Dulapur, and I should show another picture, yeah. And this is what the countryside around Dulapur looked like. Again, it's not around Dulapur, but it's like a very similar place. And you can see that this area is very intensely farmed. So it's extremely rich soil. It's a very thick layer of rich soil. The climate is very good for growing things. It's got a very hot summer, but you can still grow crops all through the year. It is a very good place for agriculture and very densely populated. Well, we went in to meet the storyteller, and I can close my eyes now, and I can see him so vividly. He was something above middle age. He was thin and wiry. He was really full of life. He was a very lively person. But the most striking thing was he had the most wonderful, bright, sparkling eyes.
Can I just
Now,
ask? It's becoming part of the background if she's not careful. See, and sometimes when he moves, I'll get her to move away.
It's okay.
Hmm?
Yeah, and some, all the people I've met in my life, that he was one person that I would honestly say was charismatic. He was a really charismatic person. Now, could we see the next picture, please? Yeah. Okay, one more time I have to say, these are not people who live in Dulapur, but they live in a village like Dulapur and also in the mid-1980s. Now this is, I'm trying to give an idea of the audience, because as we set our tape recorder up, well, first I should tell you an interesting thing. The storyteller, when we first went to see him and we said, would you tell us a story? He said, yes, I would be happy to tell you a story and you can record it too. But I have to tell you after dark. After dark. Well, later on I found out, because I became very interested in folktales after this, I found out that everywhere in the world, from Japan to Ireland, traditional storytellers only want to tell their stories at night. They want darkness for their stories. And this storyteller was the same. Well, we explained to him that we have to be back where we're staying by nightfall. We can't be out after dark. And the reason was that the roads in those days were very poor. And at night, there were people wandering around, there were animals wandering around, there were big holes in the road. It wasn't a good place to drive. And anyway, at least I was a very, very inexperienced motorcyclist. So Yogendra and I made an inviolable rule that we would always be back wherever we were staying before dark. Now, so we talked with the storyteller and we explained that and all that. And, he eventually, he agreed to tell the story in daylight, maybe because we were so strangers and exotic. And so he said, okay, he would do it. So he did. Now, one more picture, I think. The next picture. Yeah, these are just more people. You may have noticed in that last picture, there was a little girl. There were boys, young men, and a little girl. And these are more our older men. You can see some older men there, and some even a very young child there. This is the sort of disparate group that gathered around, of Dulapur people that gathered around to hear this story, just spontaneously, Nobody said there was going to be a story, but they knew this man told a good story. And so people gathered around. A very disparate group. There were rich people, there were poor people, there were men, women, and children, boys, girls. There were people of all castes, high caste, low caste. There were rakish young men, and there were distinguished elders. All kinds of people. But the storyteller wasn't at all concerned. He didn't worry about trying to keep all these people entertained and engaged. He knew he could do that. He knew he could keep them spellbound, and he did. Next picture, please. Now, the one group that I didn't have in my photographs were women. That doesn't mean there weren't women around. It just means I couldn't find any photographs of village women when I was looking for some. But I did find this photograph I took in Rajasthan. So it's somewhat to the south and the west of Dulapur, quite a distance. It's in the late 90s, 1999 instead of the 80s. But still, this woman, although her dress is more Rajasthani, still, it's a good idea of what a woman and a child in Dulapur would have looked like too. So she can stand for a Dulapur woman. But the main thing I'd like you to notice about her is that she's got her clothes, and her clothes are typical North Indian dress, traditional dress. You can see her clothes are very voluminous. And you can see she's got, they're loose fitting, and you can see she's got a scarf, a shawl. You might notice her bangles too, because bangles will come into this story. The critical thing is that the story of the prince and the vizier's son will have some shape shifting I mentioned. It'll be in the form of disguises. And there will be some men who disguise themselves as women convincingly. People who see them think they're women. Now, you might think that's a bit improbable, but if you see the way she's dressed, you can see if you wear those clothes, if you're a man and if you're a good actor, and especially with that shawl, because women, when they leave, traditional women, when they leave their village, they usually cover in North India their faces with their shawl. So if you think about that, you can see, yeah, that a man can dress as a woman in North India in traditional dress and pass successfully. So that's what I'd like everyone to notice about that. Well, I think I'm pretty well through with the introductory things I had to say. Just one more thing, and maybe we can see the next picture. Oh, yeah, the next, yeah, I should have said this. Now, in North India, from time immemorial, there have been communities that tell stories, you know, storytelling communities, and they go around and they use a scroll in the background. And the fact that I have this scroll is, I have a photograph of it, is thanks to Barbara Spode. And Barbara is with us tonight, Zooming. And she let me take a photograph of her scroll, which she bought in Rajasthan. This scroll illustrates a folk epic, a Rajasthani folk epic. So the storyteller, professional storytellers will go around and they'll use a scroll like this as a backdrop for the story. Now, could we see the next picture, please? Yeah, so this is a detail from that scroll. And this is the hero of the scroll, of the story. And, you know, if you look at him, you can see what the people in Dulapur would have thought the prince looked like. This is the sort of image they'd have in their minds of the prince in the story I'm about to tell. So you notice he's got very rich clothes. He's got a necklace there. He's got a headdress. His headdress is very elaborate. He's got long sideburns, long hair. He's got a military martial mustache, but no beard. And he's got a sword. And then you can see over here, he's on his horse, says mounted on the horse. So he's a good horseman. Well, these are all things that you'll find in the prince in the story. Now, the next one, please. Yeah. Now, I would like to go on and on and on about this folktale. I did a lot of research on it. I talked with lots of people about it. And I am sure that this particular folktale has been handed down orally from storyteller to storyteller for at least 1,000 years, and I'm sure more than that. So it's a genuine folktale handed down from storyteller to storyteller. Now, there's a lot more to say about it. And Yogendra and I published the story, The Prince and the Vizier's Son, in the original Abiti text and in English translation with introduction and notes in this book, Living Texts from India, edited by Monica Thiel-Horstman and myself. And it's our story is a chapter of this book. If you're interested, I really recommend looking at it and reading the introduction and the notes. It's available at the ANU and the Menzies Library, and it's also available in libraries, university libraries in Sydney and Melbourne. All right, well, now if we could have my face back again, yeah. Yes, okay, so now I want to tell the story of the prince and the vizier's son. As I begin, I want to make the beginning to be, I'll just say one or two sentences in the Abiti language so that you can hear what Abiti sounds like and what this story would sound like in the original. एक रहे बादशाह जादे, आओ एक रहे वजीर जादे, तो वजीर जादे का और बादशाह जादे का एक ही दिन लड़का पैदा हुआ. There was a king, and the king had a vizier. That's the Indian word for a prime minister. And on the very same day, the wife of the king and the wife of the vizier, they each had a son. Each had a son. And those two boys, they grew up so close. They were so close. They were such good friends. They were inseparable. And they grew up to become young men like that. Well, they were inseparable, but they weren't the same. No. The prince, he was an extrovert. He was outgoing. He was handsome. He was a kind of happy-go-lucky, cheerful sort of person. He was intelligent too, but he wasn't thoughtful. He was not a person he wasn't a deep thinker, not a deep thinker, but he was certainly popular. Everybody liked him. Now, the vizier's son, first of all, he was highly educated. He could read and write Sanskrit. He probably knew Persian too. Oh, he certainly knew Persian too. Very highly educated. That's what a vizier's son should be. A vizier's son should be well educated. And he was also very, very intelligent, unusually intelligent. He was also a crafty person. He was clever. In fact, many people would say he was sly. Well, the prince and the vizier's son, so close, doing everything together. And the king saw this. And the king was worried. He was worried about this. Because the king knew that there had been other cases where there had been a sharp-witted vizier and a rather guileless king, like his own son was. And that sharp-witted vizier had deposed the king and taken over rule himself. Now, the king didn't want that to happen to his son. In fact, he had to do everything possible to avoid that. And he saw the influence of this vizier's son growing day by day over his son. And finally, he realized he had to take action. So he called the vizier. He said, look, I find this really hard to do. I don't want to do it, but I have to. I'm sorry, but you're going to have to accept this. I'm going to have your son killed. Well, the vizier heard that, and he had to think fast, But viziers have to think fast. That's their business, to think fast. So he said, sire, no, you don't need to do that. Look, I will have my son sent far away, so far away, he'll never be of any concern to you ever again. Well, the king was not a cruel man, no. He said, okay, That's all right. You send your son away and it'll be okay. So the Vizier did that. He sent his son far away. Now, there was an unexpected result to this, and that is that the prince, when his friend was gone, the prince became morose. He became depressed. He fell into a deep depression, in fact, with his friend gone. He lost his healthy color. He was no longer happy. He became, he couldn't get up in the morning, you know, he couldn't get out of bed. He was in bad shape, and he just had lost his interest in life. He didn't want to eat, didn't want to drink. He lost weight. He weakened. But there was one thing that he did still like to do. The prince still had an interest in hunting. He liked to hunt. So one day he managed to drag himself out of bed. It was a nice day, and he thought, this is a good day to go hunting. So he had his horse saddled up, and he got on the horse and he rode out looking for game. He didn't find anything to shoot. It got to be midday, and it was pretty hot, and he was feeling thirsty and tired. And his horse was thirsty and tired too. So it happened they came upon a pond. And by the pond, there was a big tree. So the prince thought, all right, we'll stop here at the pond. And he got off his horse and he let the horse drink at the pond. And then he himself had a drink. And he sat down under that tree and relaxed, you know, going to rest. Well, after a while, there came along a palanquin, you know, a palanquin carried by 4 men. Each one, there's a pole, and each one has an end of the pole, front and back, and 2 sides, carrying the palanquin. And it was a palanquin, you could tell, it was a palanquin that there was a very high-class lady inside that palanquin, because it was the compartment of the palanquin had curtains all around it, because no member of the public should see the lady. You know, women didn't expose themselves if they were of wealthy or high-class background. So, so there comes the palanquin, and it happened. It got very close to where the prince was, and you know, a gust of wind came along and blew the curtains aside, and the prince's eyes and the woman inside the palanquin's eyes met. The prince was stunned. Stunned. It was love at first sight. And he just couldn't move. Even though he couldn't see the woman inside the palanquin anymore, he was just stunned. Now, the woman inside the palanquin had her bearers put the palanquin down, and she said to one of the bearers, go down to the pond, and she got out a clay pot that she had in her compartment, and this beautiful, beautiful arm came out and gave the pot to the man, and she said, go down to the pond and fill this pot with water. And so the bearer went down to the pond, and he filled the pot with water, brought it back to her, and then she said to him, okay, now pour out the water on the ground. Glug, 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 glug. So he did. Next, she said to the man, now go over there to that neem tree and break off some neem branches and bring them back. So he did. Gave them to her. And that beautiful, delicate hand, she, little bit of her arm visible, she took those neem branches and she swirled them around inside the clay pot. And when she did that, she was very careful to let her bangles jiggle and jingle. So her bangles jingled while she did that. She wanted her bangles to be noticed. And what do you think she did after that? Well, she spat. Now, then she said to her bearers, pick up the palanquin. She put the pot back in the compartment, and off they went. Now the prince was still standing there dumbstruck, or sitting there dumbstruck. And he just kept thinking about her. What a divine creature. Somehow or another, he managed to clamber on his horse and get back home. Probably the horse knew the way. He got back home, and he got off the horse, and he went immediately into his chamber, and he lay down in his bed. And that's where he stayed for the rest of that day, and the next day, and the day after that. He wouldn't eat anything, he wouldn't drink anything, wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't talk to anybody. Oh, you can imagine the king and the queen were really distraught. What could they do? They tried the royal physicians, no hope, they didn't do anything. They tried all kinds of medicines, no good, no good. And finally, the king realized that his son is going to waste away and die. Now, of course, the king didn't know anything about this woman, but he did know about his son's good friend, the Vizier's son, and he realized, my son is pining away for his friend. There's only one way to save his life, and that is to call the friend back. And so the Vizier's son was called back to come back. Now, the Vizier's son came back, and when he got to the city, and he learned that his friend, the prince, was on the verge of death, he said, well, look, can I please go in and see him alone, to be with him in his room alone? Yeah, of course, anything. So the Vizier's son went in, and he sat down there beside the prince's bed. And he said, tell me, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? And the prince said, I don't want to live. I don't want to live. I've had it with life. I'm done. I saw a woman, and she was so beautiful. I love her so much, but I don't know what her name is. I don't know where she lives. I'll never find her. I just want to die. And the Vizier's son said, well, look, tell me what happened when you saw this one. What happened? And so the prince went through the whole story about, the pots of water and that kind of stuff. And when the Vizier's son heard that, he laughed. He said, you're so silly. You're so silly. Don't you understand what she was doing? She was telling you where she lives. And she was telling you who her father-in-law is. Now, I've got to explain this. This is set in traditional times in North India. It's set in that long ago time. In those days, any adult woman was married. So naturally, the Vizier's son and the prince knew that woman that he had fallen in love with is already married to somebody. And so when she tells where she lives, she also says who her father-in-law is, not who her father is, because of course she lives in her father-in-law's house. Anyway, so the Vizier's son says, oh, look, what she did, when she got that pot of water, that clay pot of water, and she had it poured out on the ground, and you have to know the Abiti word for to gurgle is gada gada, gada gada. When she had it poured out on the ground like that, she was telling you that she lives in Gardawa, gada gada, Gardawa. And there is actually a town named Gardawa, which is not so far from Lucknow. It's a ruin now, but it was pretty much an important place in the past. Anyway, so the Vizier's son said, she says she lives in Gardawa. And she told you when she brushed or swished the neem branches around in the pot, well, she was telling you that there's a neem tree in front of her house. And when she let you hear her bangles jingle like that, And you have to remember that in Abiti, the word for bangles is churia. When she told you that, she was telling you that her father-in-law is Chubile Khan, churia, Chubile Khan. So she's told you where she lives and who her father-in-law is. And the prince was just so happy. And he really tried to get up right then. He was a bit weak, but he tried to get, he was ready to go. He said, let's go to Gardawa right now. And the Vizier's son said, no, you've got to get your strength back. We've got to be stronger and then we'll go. But love is so powerful. Well, it was no time at all before the prince was better and ready to go. And so they got on their horses and they told everybody they're going hunting. And really, of course, they were going to Gardawa. And so they did go to Gardawa. They got to Gardawa and the Vizier's son said, okay, now look, I'll go reconnoiter. I'll find out who this Chuile Khan is and where his house is. And I'll come back and let you know. Oh, good, the prince said. So the Vizier's son went off and he came back after a while. And he said, I found out that Chuile Khan is actually the richest merchant in Gardawa. And he has a mansion. And on the second story of that mansion, in the back, there's a room up on the top there. And that's where his daughter-in-law lives, where she stays. Now, that room has a window, and the window overlooks a lane. This is on the second story. And there's a lane underneath there. And the prince said, good, let's go. We'll break into the house. We'll carry off the woman. And the Vizier's son had a great difficulty persuading the prince, no, that would only bring catastrophe. That was not the way to approach it. You had to take a shrewder position. You couldn't just run in like that. And he finally convinced him. And he said, now look, what you want to do is we'll go to the mansion of Chuile Khan, and I want you to get on your horse and gallop up and down under her window in that lane, and that will tell her that you're here. And so the prince was happy with that, and he galloped his horse up and down in the lane behind her window. And of course, the woman, she heard that. She heard this racket of the horse, the jingling, stirrups and stuff that on the horse. Anyway, bridles and things. And she heard all that. And she went to the window. You have to remember, there's no glass. There's an open window there. This is old times. And she looked out and she saw the prince going up and down. Well, now, just as the prince was coming, and just before he got under her window, you know what she did? She picked up a clay pot and she raised it above her head and she hurled it down as hard as she could, and it shattered right at the bottom, right in front of the prince's horse. He was shocked and he was really angry too. And he wheeled his horse around and rushed back to where his friend, the Vizier's son, was, and he took it out on his friend. He said, you nearly got me killed, she tried to kill me with that pot. Did you see that? And it was a while before the Vizier's son could calm him, but he finally got him calmed down. He said, look, you're really dumb, aren't you? Don't you understand? When she threw that pot down, she didn't want to kill you. She was telling you that you have to get a house, rent a house in the potter's quarter, and she will come there tonight to meet you. Really? The prince said, yeah. Oh. Now, what everybody in the Dulapur audience would know is that the potters are a caste, it's a caste of people. It's a low caste. And so the potter's quarter of town would be a place where there wasn't the same moral restrictions that there are in more fancier parts of town. So the woman knew that she could go to the potter's quarter even at night, and she could move around. Nobody would take any notice. So that's why she wanted the prince to get a house in the potter's quarter where they could meet. So the prince and the Vizier's son did that. they went to the potter's quarter, and the vizier's son rented a house for the prince. Of course, he didn't stay there, but for the prince. And he told the prince, it got to be dusk, and he said, now the woman, Chawili Khan's daughter-in-law, the woman will come, and she will definitely come to you tonight. She will. You can trust me. She will. But, she may be delayed. It may take her a while. She's got to find out where you are and all that. Look, the main thing is just don't go to sleep. Stay awake at least until midnight to give her a chance to come. And the prince said to you think I'm a fool or something? I want this woman so badly. I would stay awake all night tonight, all night tomorrow night, and all night the next night just to see her. I'm not going to go to sleep. And so the vizier's son left him, went off to wherever he was staying. And the prince sat down in the bed there to wait for the woman to come. Now, the prince had the best intentions, he meant well, but he was a man who liked his sleep. And after a while, he got kind of drowsy, and before you know it, he was in deep slumber. And meanwhile, the woman did come, and she came into the room where he was, and she saw that he was snoring happily. Now, what do you think she did? Now, a lady who finds her lover asleep, she's not going to wake him up, right? So the woman didn't wake him up, no. But she did want to leave something there so that he would know she'd been there. And so she took two cloves, and she tied the cloves up in the prince's sheet, and then she left and went home. Well, when morning came and the prince woke up, he was in a bad mood. And when the vizier's son came to see how he was really angry because the woman, as far as he knew, hadn't come. And he said to the vizier's son, you told me the wrong thing again. You misled me. You tricked me again. You said she'd come and she didn't come. I stayed awake all night. She didn't come, never turned up. And the vizier's son said, well, look, have you looked around the room? Maybe she did come and you might have kind of, dozed off, and maybe she came and maybe she left something. No, there's nothing here, the prince said petulantly. And then the vizier's son said, well, look, I think you should shake out your bedding at least. And so the prince shook out his sheet. What do you know? There was a knot in the corner of the sheet. And he untied that knot, and there were two cloves there. Two cloves here, he said. Yeah, the vizier's son said, yeah, oh, two cloves. Yeah, that's right. Well, she wants you to go and meet her tonight at the goddess temple. Now, the way he knew that, and the way everybody in the Dulapur audience would also know, is that cloves are an offering often made at Hindu temples, and especially cloves are offered to the goddess. And traditionally, goddess temples were located in secluded, quiet places on the edge of town. So the woman, by leaving the cloves, is telling the prince that she wants to meet him in this secluded goddess temple. Now, there's something else there too, though. There's another layer to this meaning. And this is a layer that everybody in the audience in Dulapur doesn't know, or some of them know, but they don't want to let on they know. But the worldly wise know, and that is that in North Indian folk literature, cloves are a symbol for a woman's nipples. So you've got an erotic meaning to these cloves. And this is a good example of the way that those double meanings trigger. They trigger a response if a person is alert, and they tell the person that there is more to this than meets the eye, that there's something beneath ordinary life. There's something beneath ordinary conscious life. So that's one of those triggers that are there. Anyway, so the prince went off to the goddess temple that evening. The Vizier stayed there in the potter's quarter, and probably he stayed in the very house that they had rented. And the prince went there to the goddess temple at dusk. And he went in the temple and he sat down to wait for the woman, for Chirili Khan's daughter-in-law. Meanwhile, Chirili Khan's daughter-in-law had slipped out of the house. She snuck out of the house and she was on her way to the goddess temple. Well, I mentioned Chirili Khan is a very rich man. And he has lots of money, you know, lots of wealth. So of course, he has employed a staff of watchmen to look after his house, to watch out, to see that no riffraff is around, you know, no thieves and stuff. So there are a lot of watchmen there. And two of these watchmen see Chirili Khan's daughter-in-law sneak out of the house, and they're suspicious that something is wrong here. So they follow her. They follow her. And they follow her very stealthily. And she goes to the goddess temple. She goes in the temple. When they watch, the watchmen are watching there. And they wait, you know, for her to come out. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and they wait, and she never comes out. Now they know there's hanky-panky about going on. Something is definitely not right about this, and they know that that Chirili Khan's daughter-in-law is up to no good. So they slam the door of the temple and they bolt it. And when the prince and the woman hear the door slam, they know now they're trapped, they're caught. But she's a clever woman and she has an idea. So she calls out to the watchman outside. She calls out and says, "Go to the potter's quarter and call out in your loudest voice, shout out, 'A tiger is after the cows.' And then come back here and I'll reward you handsomely." Well, the lust for money is so strong in people that the two watchmen decide that one of them will go off and do what she says. The other one will stay and watch the temple and see that she doesn't get out. And they'll split the reward. So one of the watchmen goes to the potter's quarter and he calls out in his loudest voice, "A tiger is after the cows." Now the Vizier's son is in the potter's quarter too. He hears that and he knows that means that the woman and the prince are caught in the temple. What can he do? Well, he gets some women's clothes like that woman is wearing in the picture. And he takes off his own clothes and he puts on the women's clothes, probably puts the shawl over his face. And he gets a tray and he puts some worship stuff on it. And then he goes to the goddess temple. And he gets to the temple and of course, the watchmen are there and they've got the temple bolted. And he says, "Open up, I want to worship the goddess." And they say, "No, you can't come in. We've got some couple of rascals caught in here." And he says, "Look," the Vizier's son says, "Look, my husband left on a business trip some time ago, and I vowed to the goddess that I would worship her if the very day he comes back safely, I will come to the temple and I will worship her for Thanksgiving for bringing my husband back safely. I must go in the temple now. I have to do that worship that I promised to do to the goddess." Well, you know, that seems reasonable to the watchmen. So they say, "Okay, look, you go in, but make it snappy." And so the disguised Vizier's son goes inside, and he takes off the women's clothes he was wearing, and he exchanges with Chirile Khan's daughter-in-law. So he puts her clothes on, and she puts the women's clothes on that he had come in. And then Chirile Khan's daughter-in-law goes to the door, knocks on it on the inside, and the watchman opened the door, let her out, and then they shut the door again and bolt it. And they think that that's the woman who came in to do the worship because she's dressed in the same clothes. And she goes off and goes home. Well, after a little while longer, the watchmen decide that probably Chirile Khan, who does go off and do business during the day, of course, they figure he's probably come back home now. So they decide that one of them should go to Chirile Khan and tell him about his daughter-in-law, and the other one will stay there and be sure that they don't get out of the temple. So that watchman goes, and he goes to Chirile Khan, and he says, "Sir, I have some bad news, sir. I'm sorry, but your daughter-in-law is up to no good in the goddess temple, and my friend and I have shut her and whoever else is with her in." And this is a really serious thing, you know. This is a really serious thing, because if Chirile Khan's daughter-in-law has got up to any funny business, he will lose his family honor, and he will lose respect. It's a very serious thing. And so he says to the watchman, "All right, just wait here." And he goes upstairs to where his daughter-in-law's room is, and he peeks in. Well, there she is, sound asleep on her bed. So he goes back to the watchman and he says, "Now look, if my daughter-in-law has done anything wrong, I will have her executed. But if you and your friend have made a false accusation against my daughter-in-law, then I'm going to have you executed." And the watchman, he thinks, of course, the daughter-in-law is in the temple. He says, that's perfectly right, sir. That's very just. Yes, indeed. And so the two of them go to the goddess temple. Well, they get to the goddess temple. They meet the other watchman, and the three of them unbolt the door, swing it open, and they burst in, and there is the prince. And the prince is in a very, he puts on a very strong air, and he says, "What do you mean by this? You've had your thugs lock me. I'm a gentleman from another country, and here's this honorable woman with me, and you've had us locked in this temple. That's terrible. That's a violation of all laws of hospitality. You should be giving us protection." Well, Chirile Khan is impressed by that. And he also doesn't see his daughter-in-law anywhere. And then the watchmen now are quite worried, and they say, sir, believe us, sir, she was here. Your daughter-in-law really was here in this temple. Oh, something fishy is going on. We don't understand, but she was here. Sir, please have her undergo an ordeal by fire. And that will prove, I'm sure, that she's guilty. Please. And so Chirile Khan said, "All right, so be it." Okay. So the very next morning, Chirile Khan has a big fire built in front of his mansion. And of course, a huge crowd of townsfolk gather around because they know this is a great spectacle. You know, you don't have an ordeal by fire every day. And so they're all gathered around to see the sport. And Chirile Khan has a little iron ball put in the fire to get red hot for the ordeal. And in the crowd is the Vizier's son. And in the crowd is also the prince. But you wouldn't know that because the prince is disguised again. This time, the prince is disguised as a Dandi Sadhu. Now, a Dandi Sadhu is a wandering holy man who carries a dand, that's a rod, carries a dand. But in Abiti, dand has a double meaning. There are two meanings of dand. Dand means a rod, and dand also means a penis. So the prince is there disguised as a dandi sadhu. Now, Chirila Khan's daughter-in-law is right there by the fire, ready to take the iron ball in her hand. And the watchmen say, if she can hold that red-hot iron ball, then she's innocent. But if she can't hold it, then she's guilty. And if she's guilty, then we're innocent. And of course, if she's innocent, then we're guilty. And so that's what's going to happen. They will find out now if that woman can hold that red-hot iron ball. Now, just before she's going to take the ball, the prince in the disguised as a dandi sadhu, he has managed to get through the crowd, and he stations himself right behind the woman, right behind her. And just before she's about to take this ball, he jostles against her, seeming by accident, you know, he jostles against her. And she says, before she takes the ball in her hand, she says, if I have never been pushed by any man except this dandi sadhu here. And then she takes the iron ball in her hand, red hot. She can hold it. She's innocent. Now, why is she innocent? Well, in Abiti, the verb to push has a slang meaning of to have sexual intercourse. So she's told exactly the truth, that nobody had ever pushed her except that sadhu, who's really the prince. So she's innocent, and so she can hold the ball. And so now the watchmen are in hot water, and Chirila Khan has them thrown in jail to await their fate. So then everyone goes home. And the next morning, the Vizier's son has the prince again disguised, yet another disguise. These are tricksters, you know, shape-shifting. And he has the prince disguised this time, again as a woman, very, you know, covered in all those women's clothes. But he loads her down with really expensive jewelry, really expensive jewelry. And then he takes this woman, which is really the prince, off, and they go together to Chirila Khan's house. And there he asks the gatekeeper, he is masquerading as a foreign merchant, and he asks the gatekeeper if he can speak to Chirila Khan. So the gatekeeper calls Chirila Khan. Chirila Khan comes, and the Vizier's son, masquerading as a foreign merchant, says, friend, I'm a merchant from abroad, and I have come across a really good deal here, really good deal, and I want to clinch this deal, but I need to have some quick money. I need to have quick money. I need you to loan me so much, such and such a sum, and I will pay you back tomorrow, and you can keep this woman and her jewelry as security. Well, Chirila Khan is a bit insulted. He says, look, I am not that kind of person. I'm a righteous man. I do not take women as security. But then, you know, he looks at those jewels that she's wearing, and he changes his mind. He decides he will, after all, lend. He says, well, look, just for you, just this one time, okay, I will lend you the money and you leave the woman as security. So Chirila Khan takes the woman, and the Vizier's son goes off with the money. Chirila Khan locks or puts the woman into his inner room. That's his strong room in his mansion. Puts her there. And now I have to go back a whole year before these events that I'm telling about. We have to go back now the year before. Now, Chirili Khan has a son. I mean, you'd know that, of course, wouldn't you? Because he's got a daughter-in-law, therefore he must have a son. He has a son. And the son married the woman who's the daughter-in-law, who the prince loves. He married her exactly a year before these events took place. But he was in such a rush to go off on a long commercial journey, he didn't even consummate the marriage, but he immediately rushed off after the wedding, and he was gone for a whole year. He never came back during that year, even once. He was gone the whole time. But now, on this night, he's come back unexpectedly. So he, as soon as he gets to his father's house, he goes immediately upstairs to his wife. And he comes in the door and she looks at him. Of course, he doesn't have any idea, of course, that she loves the prince. Anyway, she looks at him and she says, "Huh, what are you doing here? Your dad's got some security down in the inner room. Why don't you go down and bother her and leave me alone?" Well, Chirili Khan's son thinks this is a big mess. This is not right. But anyway, he does go down to the inner room and he does open the inner room door and he does walk in. And there is the prince dressed as a woman sitting there on the bed. And Chirili Khan's son advances toward him. And Chirili Khan's son is about to embrace him. What do you think the prince did? Well, the prince has a knife concealed in his clothes. He whips that knife out and he slices off the tip of Chirili Khan's nose. So, Chirili Khan's son's nose, sorry. He whips out the knife and slices off the tip of Chirili Khan's son's nose. Now, Chirili Khan's son is mortified at this because in North India, traditionally, the punishment for adultery was to have the tip of the nose of the adulterer cut off. So Chirili Khan's son can't bear the shame, the scorn he would face if he goes out with a mutilated nose in his hometown. And so he rushes out of the room, he gets on his horse, and he rides off into the night and is never heard of ever again. Now, as soon as Chirili Khan's son is gone, well, the prince dashes out of the room too, and he bounds up the stairs to the woman he loves, and together they manage to get out of a window, and they escape, and they go back to the prince's city, and there they get married. Now, meanwhile, when morning comes, the vizier's son, still masquerading as a merchant, comes to Chirili Khan's house, knocks on the gate. The gatekeeper comes, he asks for Chirili Khan. Chirili Khan comes, but Chirili Khan is distraught. He's distraught. And he says to the vizier's son, "Look, I don't know how to say this, but a big disaster has befallen me. My worthless son ran off last night with his wife and your woman. I can't return your security to you." Well, the vizier's son puts on an expression of rage and he says, "You what? You're cheating me? You won't give back my security? Here's your money. I've got your money for you. And you won't give me my security? I won't stand for this. This is a crime. I'm going to take this case before the panchayat, that's the council of village, of towns, elders. I'm going to take this case before the panchayat and I will have justice there." And so he does. And the panchayat sits. And of course, they decide in favor of the vizier's son because Chirili Khan didn't give him his woman back. And that was wrong. And so they say that in order to make it good, Chirili Khan will have to give the vizier's son his daughter. Chirili Khan has a daughter too, his daughter in marriage. And so the vizier's son marries the daughter of Chirile Khan. And as soon as the wedding is over, he and Chirile Khan's daughter go back to the same city where the prince is, of course. And there, the prince and Chirile Khan's former daughter-in-law, who's now the prince's wife, and the vizier's son, who's got the daughter of Chirile Khan for his wife, the four of them live happily ever after together. Now, that's the end of the story, but it's not the end of tricksters, and it's not the end of the archetypal trickster. So I guess we should take a couple of minutes break, shall we? And then if anyone has any questions or comments or anything, I love to talk about this story. Are you there, Jean? Yeah. Good. So have you got anything to say?
Yes. No, I'll just have a few minutes break and just a toilet stop or whatever you like to do quickly. And we'll come back and have questions. So just a few minutes. All right. So don't run away. Just stay on your computer or have a toilet stop or have a drink or do something. Sorry, we can't have that supper.
So Jean, will we have a virtual supper? You know,
Have a
we
virtual
have
supper.
a virtual supper. Yeah,
That's right.
yeah, chocolate biscuits, your
Yeah.
normal, total, beautiful spread.
Maybe you could get us a coconut, Trish.
And get us a
Oh,
lot.
okay, no worries.
And find a fish for us.
Yeah. So yeah, and the fruit platter. Just imagine the fruit platter.
Oh, yes, the coconut.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. Good. Okay, thank you.
Good. All right.
Quick, few minutes.
So I was a little too active.
No, you're really fantastic. Wow, what a
No,
story.
it's difficult not to be active.
I don't know. You're very good.
Let's see, what time is it? Oh, it's 9:15.
And we'll have
What was that?
it's recording.
Oh yeah, okay. Now, how do we do this? Let's see. Well, is everybody unmuted, I guess? I've never done this before. Does anyone have any question or comment?
I have a question.
Oh, good.
Would that have been a controversial story, or would it have been funny? Like, what was the vibe when he was telling?
Yeah. Look, the audience, the people in Dulapur thought it was very, very funny. You know, they laughed at all the appropriate places. It wasn't considered a serious story. It wasn't a controversial story. It wasn't a rude story. It was just considered to be a fun story for all ages. Anyone else?
Were the prince and the son, were they seen as being like villains, or were they kind of like on anyone's side in that story?
Oh no, the prince and the vizier's son are heroes. They're the heroes of the story. So they would be seen as clever, especially the vizier's son. You know, people enjoy things like when she pours the water out, it means they should go to Gardawa. When she jingles her bangles, she's telling them her father-in-law is Chirile Khan, that kind of thing people like. And as the story, it's interesting, this folk tale is actually it was actually written down in Sanskrit around about 1000 AD. That's how I know that it's been around for at least 1,000 years. So it was written down. It is, you know, you can read it in Sanskrit. It's not the same because folk tales never stay the same. It probably was a folk tale. It probably wasn't something that someone thought up, but it probably was written down from a folktale. And it's really interesting to see how the story I heard and the Sanskrit story, how they differ, how they're the same, but they're different. Like the things that the woman does are different. For instance, that's different things that she does to give her messages. And the way I know that it isn't just that the storyteller had, of course, I know he didn't know Sanskrit. I'm sure he didn't know Sanskrit, but it is true that this story is written down. It is the Sanskrit text. It's called the Vetala Panchavanshati, the story of the 25 Vetala. It's a kind of spirit. That story has been translated into Hindi, and it's available very widely on railway stations, very cheap editions of it. And the way I know that the storyteller didn't just read that story and then tell it as a tale is because his story is it's different but the same from that story. And also I found other folk tales from other parts of India that are the same story, but they've been they evolve, because a folk tale, as it's told from teller to teller, and even as it's told by the same person at different times, they embellish it, they add things, they take away things, they realize this would be a funny thing to say, so they say that. But the story, the frame of the story is the same, but it'll change really every time it's told. Oh yeah, Trish.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, after you've told that story, have you ever thought of going to the library and telling stories to kids at the library? I think the way that you told the story was just beautiful.
Well, good. Well, thank you. I'm very happy. Very pleased.
Yeah. I could see lots of little 8-year-olds or 12-year-olds sitting on the edge of their seats listening to that story.
Yeah, well, that's a good idea.
But and I'm just wondering, could you just explain to me a bit? I'm a bit slow on this sort of stuff, but could you just explain to me about the trickster and the relationship to Jung?
Yeah. Well,
I know you talked about it at the start, but now you told the story, I'm sort of a bit confused. So could you just relate that?
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, Jung had this idea that we should all be moving along on the way to individuation, to become whole. And I think he meant by that you need to incorporate the unconscious and the conscious. As he said, the unconscious and conscious should be together. They might strive, but they should be anyway interacting, whether in a friendly way or not. And that was the whole idea, I think, of becoming a whole person, to be aware of your unconscious and of your conscious at the same time. And he felt that one way that the unconscious, because of course it's very difficult for us to be in touch with our unconscious, except in dreams and in folk tales or stories or plays, in you might say fantasy. And in that he found that in his searching through world literature and through his patients, he had the two ways of doing this. He went through his patients and how what they told him about their neuroses and their inner lives. And he also was very interested in Greek literature or myths or folk tales, Grimm's fairy tales and so on. And he found in both in his patients' inner world and in the world of the fairy tales and the myths, he found certain archetypes, certain figures that seemed to be both inside of us in our unconscious, and also in, you might say, the collective unconscious of the whole human race. And among those archetypes, one was the trickster. And he describes how the trickster, and you can see the trickster if you know the tarot deck, for example. There's the figure of the magician and the figure of the fool, and both those figures have a bit of the element of the trickster about them, because a trickster can also be tricked. It's an interesting aspect. And the main thing is that the trickster can be recognized by the fact that the trickster is fond of these sly jokes and tricks. Well, of course, in the story of the Vizier's son and the prince, there were plenty of tricks being played. And they're also able to shift shape. Well, I mentioned the disguises. They're always on the verge of tortures, or they undergo tortures. And you can see that when the woman has to hold the red hot iron ball, for example, in her hand. That's a torture. You can see that. And you can see the prince tortured by his love sickness. He's tortured by that, and so on. And then there's also the fact that the trickster is a kind of savior. And of course, each of the tricksters in the story does act as a savior. The Vizier's son saves the prince several times, and the woman saves herself and the prince when she managed to get the watchman to go and warn the Vizier about Vizier's son, about where they are. And even the prince is a savior when he takes the woman Shureila Khan's daughter-in-law away, and they escape together. So each of those characters plays all of Jung's trickster, has all the characteristics of his tricksters. So when you hear the story, and this is, I guess, is the thing, it's like when you're having a dream, if you're alert to those things, you can recognize the trickster in your dream. And when you recognize the trickster in your dream, that's the archetypal trickster, then you're establishing contact with your unconscious. And so that's the way the unconscious and the conscious can be brought together. Well, the same thing happens in a story like The Prince and the Vizier's Son, or like The Maltese Falcon, that you see in that story the tricksters, and you see the things they do, the things that they allude to, like the clothes, for example, and that triggers your, as if it were a dream, and you become aware then of the trickster, and that can help you establish contact with your unconscious and your conscious, and then you're on the way to, in Jung's view, individuation. Does that sort of help?
Richard, we've got, what we'll do is, if people want to ask questions, they can raise their hand. I've got my hand raised, and Andrew's got his hand raised, and there's a command down at the bottom of the screen under reactions that people can use if they want to speak. So Andrew had a question.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you.
Oh, yeah.
And I'll mute myself now.
Okay. Yes, Andrew?
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Richard. I was surprised that the story had not nearly as much magic and tantric supernatural powers, and sort of the trickster sort of stayed pretty mundane in the human world rather than experimenting with, black magic. In my experience, stories have a huge amount of that.
Yeah.
Can you think of any reason why this may have been that way, or am I just used to something different?
It's possible that that the storyteller was practical fellow. Maybe he was a man who didn't go for the supernatural. I don't know. That's just how he told it. But yes, like, you know, that scroll that Barbara had let me photograph, you notice in it's got a demon of some sort. So yes, they usually do, don't they? They usually do have demons or gods or, you know, something supernatural. But no, this one was really down to earth.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, was it Robbie?
Yeah, a couple of things about this story. I think one of the first surprising things about it is that it validates adultery. You know, that the hero is a philanderer and you know, seeking to steal away a married woman from her husband. She colludes in that, which has got a whole sort of series of ethical challenges about it. So that's one surprise. I think the other thing that I found really interesting about it was the obscurity of the clues. And I was reading a book about Vedic tradition and how there's a tradition of the concealment of allegorical messages within popular stories, and that the initiates explained the real meaning. And so what we've got this process is that the Vizier's son is explaining the concealed allegorical meaning behind these really extremely obscure clues. Like I think I certainly would never have guessed any of those clues. That's but the Vizier's son was remarkably astute. You know, he seemed to have some sort of hidden knowledge. So yeah, a very interesting story. Thanks.
Yeah, yes, that's right. It is. It certainly is like that. About the first thing, yes, it's interesting that you know, usually in India, people are very, very moral. You know, like you know, sexual things are usually not talked about in public anyway, and people are very anxious to always portray themselves as being very upright. And it's interesting that this story is very immoral, if you like. And I guess part of it is that I suppose it's like, you know, Hindi film, or like any film, it's quite different. I mean, the Maltese Falcon, for example, is quite different from ordinary experience, that we relish that. So I guess the people in the audience in Dulapur enjoy the fact that with a folktale, they can kind of step out of the strictures of ordinary morality, and they can, you know, sort of vicariously take part in some of these things, because certainly they wouldn't put up with anybody actually acting like that in daily life. And when you mentioned the thing about the you know, hidden meanings, and yeah, the hints are pretty pretty obtuse and difficult for anybody. But you know, I just am thinking that there are cases in Indian history. For example, there was the Maratha hero Shivaji, who is said to have escaped from imprisonment of Aurangzeb, the Mughal emperor, by masquerading as a woman and leaving. I think he left, forgotten if it was in a palanquin or what. But you know, there are historical occasions like that.
And I mean, the fact that she flirts with him so flagrantly at the start without even knowing him, like that's one of these sorts of, you know, poetic license examples. That's a bit surprising. But then the other thing that was really strange was this this business of, if you're innocent, then you'll be able to hold a red hot iron ball. Like that goes back to the sort of drowning of witches type of syndrome of just an extreme violence and indifference to people's lives. Like, you know, in reality, if that sort of trial by fire was applied, like she's scarred for life, loses the use of her hands, whether she's innocent or guilty. So it does illustrate a sort of culture of pretty extreme approaches to justice.
Yes, it does. And I was looking at Wikipedia on just that. And it says that in England, in the Middle Ages, that a person was supposed to hold a hot iron bar and walk for, I think it was 9 feet or 9 meters or something. And then if their hands healed smoothly, they were innocent. But if their hands were infected, then they were guilty. So similar idea.
Reminds me of Salem witch trials as well.
What's that?
Reminds me of witch trials as well.
Oh yes,
Idea of
that's right.
someone-
Yeah, of being dunked in water. Yeah, that's right.
I don't know whether I can. Am I
Hi,
muted?
Barbara. Hi.
Oh, I'm
Yes,
not
hi.
muted.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, I'm written down as being called admin, but I'm not actually. My name's Barbara.
Yeah, Barbara. Yeah. Thanks for that scroll. That was really came
no,
out well.
I was pleased that you enjoyed that. Just following on from what Robbie was saying, but something else that I wanted to comment and ask about. But following on from what you were saying about the cruelty of justice, there is in Indian religious stories a very early reaction against that, when Ram's beautiful wife Sita is to be tried by fire, to check that indeed she hadn't yielded to the demon that had carried her off to Lanka. She drew away from the trial, and the earth, her mother, swallowed her up. I think I'm right about that, Richard and Andrew, aren't I?
Yeah.
So that there is a sort of countervailing current in ancient and religious tales. But what I wanted to briefly say, and then ask you to comment on, Richard or anyone, when I was an undergraduate long ago at Sydney University in the psychology department, we had a lecturer called John Mays, who was a Freudian. And I remember being riveted by his Freudian interpretations of fairy stories, but they were simple folk tales. I called them fairy stories. Maybe fairy stories was a better word to use of them, but compared with the intricacy of the prince and the vizier's son, Little Red Riding Hood is very easy to deal with. It is an extraordinarily intricate story. And now I'm aware that people who really understand know a lot about folk tales can see all sorts of correspondences in folk tales across the world. I've never read a folk tale that has such clever language clues in it, where double meanings or just synonyms are so significant. And I'm just wondering whether that is common in Indian folk tales, or does anybody know of similarly clever linguistic clues or details in folk tales from Europe, let's say?
Yeah, I know I've read some, but I can't think of any. Can anyone think of any? I know there are.
And in other Indian folk tales?
Yeah, I know there are, but I can't think of them now. Yeah, there are. Does anything pop into anyone's mind? Yeah, I know that there are. I know in a lot of Indian stories have a lot of wordplay. But I just can't give any examples right now.
So in Indian ones, more than say folk tales in English that you know.
I just don't know. I don't know enough about you know, folk tales in Europe, but I do think that I understand that the European folk tales are only a shadow of what they might have been before they became kind of Baudelarized for children, you know.
Yes.
And they may have been much more complex.
Yeah. Thanks.
Although the Grimm stories are far more grim or far more violent than the contemporary versions of them.
That's right.
The original.
But that one of the problems with that use of puns is that they don't translate, and you know, so for example, some people say that Jesus Christ as the Son of God is a parable for the Son, but I mean that's one that works in English, but doesn't work in the original language.
No.
So finding that use of puns, but still there is very extensive use of parable. Whether there's the use of punning in the way that the story uses, I'm not that familiar with it either.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but of course, puns and wordplay is something that people have been fascinated with over the centuries, over the ages. I would think, you know, you find that in more formal literature. Yeah. Jasmine, yeah, you have a question? Any other?
May I jump in again
Oh,
there?
yes, Andrew, yes.
Thanks, yeah. No, just in reference to Barbara's question, I'm trying to think, none of the folk tales that I've come across actually have connections to that kind of wordplay in the same way.
Oh, right.
But then that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. It's just I'm not able to think of any examples at the moment.
I can't think of any either.
So yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Can I just ask another question? Yeah. You know how you put up the curtain with the storyboard?
Yeah.
You know, that Barbara's picture of that.
Yeah.
Would something like that have been used when people were telling this story in Oud? Or
no, I don't think so. No, I mean, the storyteller that told the story to me, as far as I know, he was just a person, you know, talented at telling a story. But there wasn't anything like that, and I've never heard of anything like that in Uttar Pradesh. That particular one is the story, the folk epic of Pabuji in Rajasthan. And I think it's mainly a Rajasthani thing, maybe.
Yeah, when I've heard about it, I think it has been in a description of the itinerant storytellers. Unlike your man who belonged to that village where you met him, Richard, I think it's been the itinerant storytellers who had a scroll like that to unwrap. As they performed, and particularly in Rajasthan or nearby.
That's right. And my colleague Yogendra has told me that, you know, there's been a tremendous change as well in his lifetime, like you know, the effect of television and radio and now mobile phones, all those things really hit hard at those itinerant storytellers, because they really can't compete, you know, with the lure of those modern things.
So Richard, I'm just wondering, Jeff's got his hand up, but he can't wave his hand because he's having trouble with his
It's Shauna.
Oh, Shauna. Oh, hi, Shauna.
Yeah, we're both here. We've got it coming through to the TV, but we're just having trouble with the laptop.
Yeah, sure.
But Richard, thank you. That was wonderful. It was really great the way you told it, and the story's fantastic. I was going to say, in a society that is quite rigid, and infidelity would be really not allowed to happen, or if it did, you'd be expelled from the family and everything else. This is kind of like a shadow story, and it's also a safe way for people to deal with something that is such a taboo topic.
Yep. That's right. Yeah, definitely. It's kind of like a dream, isn't it? In the sense that, you can let all kinds of things happen in your dreams.
Yeah, and especially if everyone sits around and listens and laughs, and it really kind of diffuses some shadow thing in the culture, doesn't it?
It does, and it's definitely set in a time. I mean, it's not the time we live in. It's definitely another time. It's a time out of time. So it's not threatening in that way. Yes,
Richard, this is Rajiv here. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Rajiv, I can hear you. Can Richard hear you?
I can just barely.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, hi, Rajiv. Yes, I can hear you now.
Hi. Thanks for a lovely story, and it takes me back, obviously, to my childhood in Lucknow.
Yeah. Yes.
It is. I mean, I can't for the life of me go back to any such memories of intricate stories, but I do remember the Vikram and Baital stories during our childhood. They were quite sort of popular. Yeah. And I think there was a television series that got made, I think maybe about 25, 30 years back on the Vikram Baital stories. Oh, right. But I was also just wondering whether there is, I mean, apart from infidelity, as there's a theme of, or there is a thing about rescuing someone who's trapped in a really bad situation, where this person's kind of married this woman and sort of just deserted and left on journeys unknown. Yep. And then there is this Prince Charming who comes along and rescues the lady, so to say. Yes. I guess there is that twist as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's like the woman in this story. If you consider her husband has left her right after the marriage, really, I guess in modern terms, the prince is rescuing her from not a very satisfying marriage.
Mm. But her husband doesn't appear in the story at all.
Oh, well, remember, her husband is Chirele Khan's son, who comes and gets his nose cut off.
Oh, okay, sorry, at the end, that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's not very welcome when he comes back, because he hasn't bothered to come. It's been a whole year and he hasn't turned up.
Yeah, well, he did leave, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
Tina has a question.
Oh yes, Tina.
Yeah, it's not just the love story, I guess, but also that the woman comes into the vizier's sons and the prince's lives, and she's brought them back together because they were best friends.
Yep.
And so I think there is a bit of magic in there, is that she's the one who's brought them together, and without the prince, without the vizier's son, the prince would be totally lost and forlorn, and never, he doesn't understand the clue that the clues right. that the woman is giving. So it's a beautiful story in that way, that those relationships are being brought together.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if she hadn't come on the scene, the prince would have just kind of wasted away in depression, and but she came on the scene, and then his friend came back. Yeah, they form, that's right. She really brought everything together.
Yeah, and there's a common theme with stories is that you have the sort of dumbass lovesick boy, and then someone's got to come and help him.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Is someone else raising their hand?
I just wanted to follow up further on the role of the Vizier's son as something that's, I suppose, points towards a deeper religious meaning, that we need a guide, and that's whether it's a guide to the afterlife, or somebody who's able to interpret the parables, or somebody who's able to give us a clue that these stories are for initiates, and they are incomprehensible for us unless we have the psychopomp, the guide of the soul, who's able to escort us through and explain the meaning.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, if you had known that storyteller, you might have thought that he filled that kind of role, because he really was a very, very mysterious and attractive and charismatic person.
Was he quite animated in the way he told the story?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he you had all those children, like there's a little boy in that first picture who looks really mischievous, and the storyteller was able to, he had some slapstick kind of things for the children, and he had those adult twists like the clothes for the adults. It was really good. It was amazing. Yeah.
I don't suppose you have any clue, Richard, how common is that story or a version of it? I think I didn't quite absorb something in your introduction about that. To what extent is that confined to a little circle in that part of UP?
No, it's not. It's as I say, it's
did you say in Sanskrit?
Yeah, it first appears in the Vaisala Panchavanchati.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I did take that in and I forgot.
Yeah, and it looks like a folktale that was incorporated into that Sanskrit work, and that fascinated me because I actually hadn't realized that, and I gave a talk on it in the Netherlands, and at Utrecht University, and someone there said, "Oh, that story is in Sanskrit in the Vaisala Panchavanchati," and indeed it was. And then I tried to find out, because I just thought it was a folktale, and then I thought, oh my goodness, maybe it's just something that that man picked up, from the railway station, from a Hindi translation of that Sanskrit story, because it is, as I say, quite popular in popular literature. And so I did a lot of sleuthing around, and I discovered that there are at least two other folk tales that have been recorded of this same. It's clearly the same story, but of course it's been changed a bit, as they do, and that's what led me to believe that actually this is a fairly wide occurring in North India folk tale that probably goes back to it seemed to me anyway, that goes back to the source from which the Sanskrit one was taken 1,000 years ago.
Okay, sorry, I think I was not understanding properly. So that sort of raises the question of what you call a folk tale, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Which is something that people debate anyway. Yes.
Yes, but I do think it definitely is. It definitely has its origins in oral literature rather than I don't think the Sanskrit version is the, I don't think
the origin.
I don't think that's right. I don't think someone composed it, or created it.
Okay.
Yeah. But that's just a kind of a guess, I guess. Yeah. Well, it's 10 o'clock. Yeah, it's time for Jean.
Could I just say before Jean, like, I think we need to, like, this is the first time we tried this sort of thing, and I just want to really thank Robbie Tulip, and Robert James for all of the work that they've done to make this happen. Like, it's sort of not easy, and I'm hoping that if you have any feedback about it, if you could let us know at the Jung Society. But I really want to acknowledge the amount of work that's gone into this to make it happen by Robbie, Robert, Jean and Richard. So I just want to acknowledge that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to
Thanks
say
very
thank
much,
you very
Trish.
much for coming on board tonight. And thank you, Richard, for absolutely fantastic rendition of its story. It was just fabulous. And, it was just blown away by that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say thank you for everyone for attending tonight and for continuing on, because I know it's not always easy to be spending the evening listening to a story, particularly Friday night. It's always a hard night. Particularly I find that's a hard night for me because I'm teaching during the week, and I'm still doing teaching, even online, doing a lot of online work at the moment. So we have Timothy Hatfield coming on in the 8th of October. Hopefully we'll be back in our place. If not, we'll be on Zoom. He's going to talk about the scholastic ideology of learning, on thinking, driven by questions rather than answers. He's a recent PhD student, so we thought we'd like to give him a go for the Jung Society, because I'm looking for young blood at the moment, young people with doing interesting things. So he's somebody that I've met through Dorothea's group, folk story group, Tales. So he's quite an amazing young person. So I'd like to come along to the Jung Society. And I'd like to say thank you very much for Robbie, always there for us, and for Trish too, always there, and for Richard, always there in the Jung Society, and my lovely husband. Without my lovely husband, we wouldn't really be here tonight, I think.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
He's a computer programmer, so he's a computer man.
Yep,
So
good. Yeah.
He gets
Great.
together. He tutors me in computing, because I'm sort of, and the kids at school are tutoring me as well.
Yeah. It's also new, isn't it? Like, yeah, but I think you've done a great job tonight. Good on you guys. Yeah, great.
We're here at Richard's place because he wanted to give him every contact for him.
This isn't being recorded, is it? Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Oh, okay. So can you stop the recording? Yeah.
Oh, Robert's, I think it's been recorded tonight. So, yeah, we have recording because we've got people that have missed out. So we'd like them to be able to listen to.
Yeah, sure, but we don't need to record this bit. Yeah.
And the link will be available on the Jung Society webpage. So there's quite a library of the talks that have been given, so people can go on and watch the talks as well as see the written material on the website, which is a very good resource.
Yeah, then Robert's two Roberts putting it together. So thank you very much. We just loved seeing everybody tonight, and I think we've had a wonderful Friday night tonight. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you on the 8th of October. Okay. Bye-bye now.
Good.
Thanks, June. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Great to catch up. Great to catch up. Okay.